I came out with all the makeup on and all the eyelashes and all the hair. They said, Richard is a good boy. I never was a good man, but I was a good boy.
It hurts, doesn't it?
I'm sorry.
But look what you have done with your life. He is phenomenal.
You
are.
When hotel staff opened the door to little Richard's suite, they expected to find the usual mess left behind by a traveling rock star. But what they uncovered inside that room was something far more unsettling. Scattered across the bed were strange handwritten notes filled with confessions, alongside elaborate costumes drenched in glitter and sequins that seemed untouched. Religious texts lay open next to bottles of makeup and wigs, as if two worlds had collided within the walls of that single space. Whispers spread quickly through the staff. This wasn't just a room, it was a snapshot of the man's tortured soul. To some, it looked like evidence of a breakdown. To others, it was a treasure chest of secrets. The shocking discovery raised more questions than answers. Who really was little Richard behind the stage lights? And why did this room, of all places, hold the key to his most hidden battles? Long before his name became synonymous with wild performances and flamboyant showmanship, little Richard was just Richard Wayne Penniman, a boy born into poverty in Macon, Georgia. Life in the segregated South was far from easy, and Richard's early years were marked by hardship, rejection, and a search for belonging. Yet even then, there was something about him that refused to be ignored. His booming voice carried through the church pews where he first sang gospel, and his larger-than-life personality made him stand out in a world that often tried to silence him. By the early 1950s, Richard had found his way into the world of rhythm and blues, but he wasn't content to blend in. He wanted to explode, and that's exactly what he did. When he pounded the piano keys with unmatched ferocity and unleashed his now iconic scream, "A wop, bop, a loo, bop, a wop, bam, boom!" The world was never the same. Tutti Frutti wasn't just a song. It was a cultural earthquake. His makeup, pompadour, and high-energy antics on stage broke barriers and made him both a sensation and a scandal. Parents clutched their pearls, while teenagers screamed with excitement. Little Richard had forced rock and roll into America's living rooms, whether people liked it or not. But with fame came controversy. His gender-bending style, wild wardrobe, and unapologetic behavior challenged social norms at a time when conformity ruled. He was praised by some, condemned by others, but either way, he could not be ignored. Elvis Presley himself once admitted that Little Richard was the true king of rock and roll. Chuck Berry, James Brown, and even the Beatles credited him as their inspiration. Yet behind the glitter, behind the pounding rhythms and manic energy, Richard carried a heavy burden. He was not just creating music, he was fighting against a world that told him he could not be who he truly was. His meteoric rise set the stage for the battles, contradictions, and shocking discoveries that would later be revealed in that infamous hotel room. To the world, Little Richard was the ultimate showman, a man who could set a stage on fire with nothing but a piano, a microphone, and his uncontainable energy. But behind the curtain, his life was anything but simple. Richard lived in constant tension between two identities, the preacher and the performer, the sinner and the saint. He grew up deeply rooted in the church, where gospel music shaped his earliest dreams. Yet the same church that gave him a voice also condemned his flamboyant style and his attraction to men, something Richard would spend his entire life wrestling with. He often called rock and roll the devil's music, even as he helped invent it. At the height of his fame in the late 1950s, Richard shocked the world by suddenly abandoning his career mid-tour to enroll in Bible school. Fans couldn't believe it. How could the wild man of rock turn his back on the very music that made him a legend? But that was Richard's pattern. He would give himself fully to music, then retreat into religion, only to be pulled back again by the roar of the crowd. This tug-of-war defined his life. He would give fiery sermons by day, then play to screaming fans by night. He would declare his devotion to God, only to fall back into the temptations of fame, drugs, sex, and a lifestyle that clashed violently with his spiritual beliefs. In interviews, he often admitted to throwing away fortunes, leaving behind homes and cars, and even disappearing for years at a time when his conscience weighed too heavily on him. The truth is, Little Richard wasn't just battling fame, he was battling himself. This internal struggle left scars that followed him into every hotel room, every tour bus, every private space he inhabited. And when staff stepped into that infamous hotel room years later, the objects they found told the story of a man who lived in extremes, torn between salvation and sin, caught between the pulpit and the piano. It was this very duality that made Little Richard both magnetic and deeply misunderstood. The setting was unremarkable at first glance, just another hotel tucked along the bustling strip of a city Little Richard often visited on tour. But for those who worked there, this particular booking stood out from the beginning. When Richard arrived, he didn't slip in quietly. He swept into the lobby surrounded by an entourage of friends, assistants, and curious hangers-on who trailed behind him carrying stacks of luggage and garment bags bursting with sequined costumes. His energy was magnetic, even off stage. Guests in the lobby whispered to each other, realizing they were in the presence of a living legend. The hotel staff, however, noticed more than just his charisma. They observed his strange habits almost immediately. Richard was known for making unusual requests, sometimes ordering entire trays of food only to leave them untouched, or demanding extra mirrors for his room so he could prepare his elaborate looks. One housekeeper remembered being asked to bring up stacks of clean towels, only to later find them never used, still neatly folded in a corner. Other staff recalled nights of loud music, sudden bursts of shouting, and the sound of a piano echoing from his suite, though no one ever saw a piano being brought in. The hotel had seen its share of celebrity guests, but Richard was different. There was a kind of intensity that followed him, as though he was carrying a storm inside. Some days, he would strut through the halls like a king, greeting everyone with his famous high-pitched laugh. On others, he locked himself away, not allowing anyone inside for hours, sometimes days. The atmosphere around his room was electric, almost unsettling. Employees joked nervously about what went on behind the closed doors, but there was also a quiet unease. Something about his stay didn't feel like the ordinary chaos of a rock star on the road. It felt heavier, stranger, as if the walls themselves were holding on to a secret. And when that room was finally opened after his departure, the hotel staff would realize that their instincts had been right all along. When the door finally swung open, the hotel staff braced themselves for the usual aftermath of a celebrity stay. Empty bottles, scattered clothes, maybe some forgotten jewelry. But what they stepped into was nothing short of bewildering. The air itself felt heavy, as if the room carried the weight of two different worlds colliding. On the bed, spread out like a costume department gone wild, were dazzling outfits that looked more suited for a Las Vegas stage than a hotel suite. Sequined jackets, feathered capes, and shimmering trousers. Yet beside them, there lay stacks of Bibles, hymnals, and worn religious pamphlets, some marked with Richard's scribbled notes in the margins. Next to the vanity, dozens of wigs rested neatly on stands, each styled to perfection. Jars of foundation and eyeliner were scattered across the dresser, their lids left open as though he had rushed out mid-preparation. But among them sat something unexpected. Handwritten pages torn from hotel stationery, filled with frantic writing. Some lines read like prayers, begging forgiveness, while others resembled confessions, raw and unfiltered, where Richard seemed to pour out his guilt and inner torment. One note even appeared to list his sins, naming moments of weakness alongside pleas for salvation. The minibar, usually stocked with alcohol, had been emptied not of liquor, but of unopened bottles of soda and candy bars, suggesting Richard had indulged in his childlike cravings rather than drowning himself in booze. In the corner of the room, untouched trays of food were stacked high, entire meals ordered and never eaten, like silent monuments to his restless state of mind. But perhaps the most unsettling detail was the presence of a small wooden cross left at the center of the bed, carefully placed, as if it was meant to guard the room after he left. To the staff, it was a confusing sight. To outsiders who later heard the story, it was a haunting window into a man divided. Was this the sanctuary of a troubled soul seeking God? Or the chaotic lair of a rock and roll icon, unable to let go of the world that made him famous? In truth, it was both. The discoveries in that hotel room weren't just oddities. They were evidence of little Richard's lifelong struggle between glory and guilt, excess and redemption. The shocking assortment inside that hotel room was more than just a collection of objects. It was a reflection of the chaos that lived inside little Richard himself. Every glittering jacket and feathered cape screamed of the performer who electrified audiences across the world, while every Bible and scrawled prayer revealed a man desperate to save his soul. It was as if the room itself had become a stage where two sides of Richard battled for dominance. His handwritten notes in particular revealed an inner torment that fame could never soothe. One page read like a sermon, urging himself to repent, while another listed temptations he claimed had dragged him away from God. There were references to drugs, to lust, to pride. The very things that made him a star also seemed to weigh on him as sins too heavy to bear. And this wasn't new for Richard. Throughout his life, he spoke openly about how guilt consumed him after performances. He once admitted that after concerts, when the lights dimmed and the applause faded, he often collapsed into tears, convinced he had sold his soul for success. The contents of the hotel room were proof that his war with himself never ended. It only intensified with time. To many who heard about the discovery, the most haunting detail was the small wooden cross laid carefully at the center of the bed. It was not placed haphazardly. It was deliberate, as though Richard wanted to sanctify the very space where he struggled the most. That cross symbolized his yearning for redemption, even as he surrounded himself with the very tools of the life he tried to escape. The untouched trays of food and soda bottles also spoke volumes. They painted the picture of a man restless, unable to find comfort in either indulgence or abstinence, caught in a cycle of excess and denial. This duality was the essence of little Richard's life, a man too flamboyant to ever be contained, yet too spiritual to ever feel free. What the staff uncovered in that room was not just shocking, it was tragic. It showed that behind the laughter, behind the makeup and the sequins, little Richard carried a burden heavier than fame itself. The constant fear that he could never reconcile who he was with who he wanted to be. For years, those closest to little Richard spoke about the contradictions they witnessed firsthand. Bandmates recalled nights on the road where he would deliver a blistering performance, then retreat backstage to read scripture as if trying to wash the music off his soul. One musician remembered Richard throwing his diamond rings into a river during a fit of guilt, only to buy more the very next week. It wasn't just superstardom they saw, it was a man wrestling with himself. Hotel staff who crossed paths with him told similar stories. One maid described walking into his suite and hearing him shouting prayers so loudly she thought he was preaching to a congregation, only to realize he was alone. Another worker said Richard often tipped generously, slipping cash into their hands while whispering, "Pray for me." Friends described how he could captivate a room with laughter, then suddenly fall silent, staring off as though haunted by something unseen. His close confidants claimed the discoveries in that infamous hotel room, the wigs, the costumes, the Bibles, the desperate notes, were no surprise at all. "That was Richard," one former associate explained. "He was two people living in one body, and neither one could ever win." Some insiders even suggested that his extremes fueled his genius. Without the inner conflict, they argued, the world might never have gotten the explosive performer who changed music forever. But others saw it differently. They viewed the room's contents as a cry for help, a sign that Little Richard's private torment had reached unbearable levels. To them, the man who made millions dance and scream on stage was silently screaming himself. Eyewitness accounts painted a portrait of a star both larger than life and heartbreakingly fragile. And as the details of what was uncovered began to spread beyond the hotel walls, the public too would soon be forced to confront the unsettling truth about the man behind the legend. When whispers of the strange discovery in Little Richard's hotel room began to circulate, reactions were immediate and divided. To some, it was nothing more than eccentric behavior from a man known for extravagance. After all, wasn't Little Richard always larger than life? But to others, the details were deeply unsettling. Fans who had idolized him as the fearless architect of rock and roll were confronted with a far more fragile reality. A man at war with himself. Newspapers and gossip columns hinted at the story, describing oddities left behind by the singer without giving away every detail. Reporters wrote of Bibles stacked alongside sequined costumes, of strange notes that blurred the line between confession and delirium. It was sensational, but it was also deeply humanizing. Many saw it as proof that fame had not shielded Little Richard from suffering. In fact, it may have intensified it. Within fan communities, debates raged. Some argued that Richard's spiritual turmoil was part of what made him great, that his constant tension between the sacred and the profane gave his music its unmatched fire. Others felt sorrow, believing he had lived a life trapped between two worlds, never able to find peace in either. Religious leaders weighed in, some praising Richard for his attempts to return to God, others condemning him for mixing sacred devotion with what they saw as sinful indulgence. Meanwhile, fellow musicians mostly responded with compassion. Many of his peers had lived through their own struggles with addiction, faith, and fame, and they recognized the signs of a man burdened by forces bigger than himself. What made the public reaction so powerful was the way it forced fans to see beyond the glitter. For years, Little Richard had been treated as almost mythical, a whirlwind of sequins, sweat, and screams who seemed untouchable. But the truth was far more complex. The hotel room revelations stripped away the legend and exposed the man. Brilliant, tortured, and searching. In the end, the aftermath didn't diminish his reputation. It deepened it. People no longer saw Little Richard as just a rock and roll pioneer. They saw him as a human being caught in the same struggles that haunt so many. only magnified by the blinding glare of fame. And if anything, the mystery of what was found in that room only added to the mythos, making him both more legendary and more tragic in the eyes of the world. The shocking discoveries inside that hotel room, sequined costumes piled beside Bibles, wigs resting next to handwritten confessions, and a wooden cross deliberately placed at the center of the bed, were not just oddities left behind by a famous musician. They were symbols of a man who spent his entire life living between two worlds. Little Richard was not only the flamboyant pioneer who electrified stages with Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally. He was also a soul perpetually torn between salvation and temptation, between the pulpit and the piano, between the gospel church of his childhood and the rock and roll empire he helped build. That room became a metaphor for everything Richard represented: contradiction, brilliance, chaos, and devotion. For fans, the story of the hotel room forced a reckoning. It challenged the myth of untouchable stardom, reminding the world that even icons carry burdens too heavy to hide. Little Richard's life was lived at extremes. He was at once a sinner and a preacher, a rule breaker and a moralist, a man who could make millions dance with joy while collapsing into guilt when the curtain closed. The contents of that room told this story more clearly than any biography ever could. Each object was a clue to a larger truth. Greatness often comes with torment, and genius is rarely free of demons. To those who loved him, the revelations only deepened their admiration. The hotel room was not evidence of weakness, but of humanity. It showed that behind the glitter and laughter was a man who fought tirelessly to reconcile who he was with who he wanted to be. And in many ways, that struggle made him relatable. It made his triumphs even more remarkable because they were won not in spite of his turmoil, but through it. Even in his later years, when Richard withdrew from the spotlight, he continued to embody this duality. One moment he was preaching fiery sermons, condemning the very music he had once pioneered. The next, he was appearing on stage again, dazzling audiences who still craved his brilliance. It was as though he could never fully let go of either side of himself. And maybe that was his fate all along. Today, the mystery of that hotel room has become part of Little Richard's legacy, another layer to his legend. Just as Elvis had Graceland and Michael Jackson had Neverland, Little Richard left behind a space that told its own story. Not of luxury, but of conflict and confession. It is a reminder that history's greatest artists are not remembered solely for what they gave on stage, but also for the mysteries they carried in private. In the end, what they found in that room was not shocking because it was bizarre. It was shocking because it was honest. It was the raw, unfiltered truth of a man who gave the world joy while carrying his own pain in silence. And that truth only cements his place as one of the most complex, fascinating figures in the history of music. Little Richard didn't just invent rock and roll. He lived it, he fought it, and he paid the price for it. The hotel room was simply the evidence left behind. As fans look back on his life, one thing remains certain. The contradictions that tormented him were the same contradictions that fueled his genius. Without them, there would be no Little Richard as the world knew him. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. That out of struggle came brilliance, out of conflict came history, and out of one man's torment came a sound that changed the world forever.